Okay, so after New World decided to crash again, we'll keep on persevering as a showcase of doing some testing for New World. So let's get back to it. I've swapped my microphone just to try something a bit new. So I'm actually using the one that's built into the Logitech, just to kind of see / taste the difference. So a couple of things on here, I suppose. The first one was around how to, I guess, spec to support the amount of memory that's required for all of these applications to run. And probably if you're looking at the live stream, that you know, part of it is once they start becoming quite kind of high utilization of your CPU, then suddenly you're going to have this problem of context switching between different priorities, right? So at the moment, even though it's kind of saying to me from a performance perspective, you know, I'm running fine. You know, my GPU might be at 91%, 70 hertz, which is, you know, not that much. But 70 C, which is not that hot. You know, it can get a lot hotter. You know, my CPU is running at 50%, which again is not a major problem. You know, it's not really grueling anything at the moment. And my memory, again, I'm running about half, which I've got 32 gig on. Now I'm running 32 gig at 3600 megahertz, so you know that's the speed of the memory. And so in theory, you know, I should be in a good position. Again, my drives aren't really getting any real kind of hit. I'm running M2 Gen 4 drives, which have a 6 giga transfer rate, 6 gigabytes per second transfer rate. I'm also using direct storage because I'm using Windows 11, which is utilized for the games. So, you know, again, that should make things load very quick, which it does, but also give me that kind of speed as far as the rest of my applications. Now, typically what I will do is I will always have 2 drives. You know, I won't partition a drive because then you're just going to switch between, you know, reading at certain parts of the drive. Have 2 separate drives, one for your primary, your boot OS, and then one for you know, using installing your applications. So I think, you know, load runners are probably a good example. It can be quite heavy if you're running it as a controller. So, you know, I install the actual install on the S drive or whatever drive is my secondary drive, and then I typically will you know, also write to that drive as far as things like the database and what it's pulling down as far as you know, as it's executing, it's pulling the information and writing to disk. So then I can kind of isolate that second drive to know when I open up my stats, I can look at it and go, okay, so my C drive is just not doing anything at the moment. My D drive is not doing anything. And then I've got my Google Drive, which is now mounted as a virtual host, and S, which is my kind of my 3 terabytes with the kind of content, right? So, you know, from my point of view, that's absolutely fine. You know, there's plenty of bandwidth. Both of those drives, like I said, are M2 drives, Gen 4, 6 gig a second read and write. You know, plenty of capacity for this. But again, Windows 11 direct storage requirements are an M2. Well, it's not an M2 drive. It says you can get away with just anything that's over 256 gig of SD kind of SSD kind of connectivity, but it's not really the case. You know, part of it is you need a lot more really, and you need it to be a dedicated drive. And you know, again, it's quite confusing because your generations of SSD drives kind of, unless you're using M2, and even M2 first gen on that rate, you really need to be looking at least Gen 3 or Gen 4 from an M2 drive. But again, you need to have a supporting motherboard that's going to support that. So again, it's got to be, like if you've got a B450 or something on an AMD, or maybe a 10th, less than 10th generation Intel chip, you really are going to need to potentially upgrade that, your motherboard to be able to support that speed. So what I'm running at the moment, which is the latest generation for AMD, with the latest board, which supports Gen 4. It's got two M2 ones, one at the front of the board and one at the back. No idea why. And then I've got heat sinks on both of them because they get incredibly hot. And I've not got my Alienware here at the moment, but obviously when I was using my Alienware, literally it blew up while I was doing a session with Tarek, doing a live stream, because it just overheated, and it was just, so the fact that you've got to think about, your drive heat, not just your GPU heat and your CPU heat, is kind of slightly concerning. But I remember going back to the days when I used to have things like Western Digital Raptors, which were 7200 drives, and they also had things like quantum fireballs. Oh, I've actually got an Epic, my first Epic drop, which is exciting, but it's no use to me because it's got strength and dexterity, which are things that I just don't need. Hopefully it's not bind on equip, so I can at least flog it. Well, it is bind on pickup, typical. Anyway, so part of it is you need to be able to have something which is going to kind of support you at least for X amount of years. I guess we didn't really think Windows 10 was going to need to be kind of swapped out, I suppose, is the easiest way of saying it. We kind of thought that 10 was going to go on for a while, but I think part of it is I think there's some kind of underlying security worries that Microsoft had, where they kind of thought, we've got some vulnerabilities here, let's improve the security, let's build it on TPM 2.0, let's build it on physical hardware chips, security hardware chips, instead of just relying on at the software level. And I think what we're probably going to find out at some point in time is that's the big push for 11, is to make it a lot more secure from a hardware perspective, not just to force everybody to upgrade their machines. So here we've got a Gen 1 Surface Book, which doesn't actually support TPM, interestingly, but it's running Windows 11. Now, it was running Windows 11 in beta, if you remember watching the Testing World session. And at that point in time, they didn't enforce that you needed TPM 2.0, which it didn't have. And then it was specifically called out by Microsoft. Yeah, Gen 1 and 2 Surface Books are just not going to work. But Gen 2 supports it if you've got the latest Intel chip, Intel i7, and part of that I think probably kicked off quite a lot of that. The Surface devices weren't even compatible. So I still have a non-compatible Surface book, which is, unfortunately, the generation, even though it's in theory still very new, part of it is this device doesn't have TPM2. It will not physically install onto it, even though it's newer than this Surface Book first generation. But it's using kind of an Intel, classic CPU, a gold CPU, not a one that supports the TPM security. And surprisingly, this Surface Book Gen 1 with the firmware update did support TPM2 in the end, so it actually allowed me to install it. However, since launch of 11, they have kind of created a registry hack which allows you to install it on, let's call it legacy hardware, which anything that wasn't built in the last 2 years, shall we say, that actually allows you to kind of ignore the TPM 2.0. Now I think what they're going to do, a bit like Google and their Pixel phones, is they're probably just going to not let you get security updates in a year's time, or end of life those support for updates, come 2022. So, I wouldn't be surprised if that happens. And yes, it's going to force a lot of people to upgrade their entire rig in the next kind of couple of years if they want to go to 11. And you might say, well, I don't want 11. I don't want that horrible taskbar in the middle of my screen. But you can move it back to the normal position. That's not really the big selling point. Yes, it looks a bit more Mac-like, and I've been using it since the early release days, and I must admit it's not Windows Vista by any chance, but when it comes to things like file copying and basic functionality like that, it does struggle a little bit. Like this genuinely would not copy any files to any directories after a couple of weeks of using it. But I'm running Windows 11 now on it, the full release candidate version, and it is fine. I've not had any problems, but I can kind of foresee that this historic, this has obviously got a fairly old SSD in there. It's probably needing a lot more of the hardware capabilities, the HAL kind of level than it probably did before, which was everything is just a disk unless it's something like an M2, and then it puts the actual adapter in there on your system properties. So I think part of it is a lot of people are going to have to upgrade if they want to keep to the Windows 11. Also kind of lost Windows 32-bit mode, which you might say, well, nobody loads 32-bit apps anymore. But yeah, that might be true, but I think there was a kind of a few things with that is, I always used to find my Office for some unknown reason would install by default by 32-bit, even with the standard installer, even though, my chip, memory and everything else was 64-bit, so why the hell did it need 32-bit? Why was it installed in 32-bit? And you then had to force it by installing the 64-bit loader, and then it'd say, oh, well, you've got a component which might be some DLL of bloody Visio that is still 32-bit, and you must uninstall every single Office component and supporting component before we can upgrade you. And that, to me, that was really annoying. Because I wanted to run in 64, I wanted kind of maximum compatibility between devices. So I don't want a mixture of 32 and 64-bit. So I guess Windows 11 coming in and enforcing the 64-bit is a big step, but it also I guess is going to cause a lot of problems with people who've kind of written their testing software that supports, is in 32-bit. So a classic example of this would be WinRunner. So, I love WinRunner, but one of the challenges with WinRunner was that it only ran 16-bit. So when I wanted to use it for kind of, let's call it retro purposes, I had to load it in a VM on something like Windows XP, right, which supported 16-bit processing. Now, if you're going to run that, I think you'll probably find you're having to run, a Hyper-V with Windows 10 to support 32-bit, and then a Windows, Windows 10 Hyper-V, even though I don't know if you can pass through twice, running, something like XP so that you can run, your 16-bit apps. And I think that is dependent on your hardware layer from a CPU support for the VTX capabilities, whether or not you can allocate memory at 2 levels or 1 level. Obviously, it's a kind of a container within a container within a container. Things start getting quite complex. But yeah, so you've got to have that kind of support, and one of the things that I think 11 has also brought, which most of you might say, well, I don't want that either, is that a bit like the M1 laptops now support the ability to run native iOS and iPad apps on there within the platform. I think that's a bug as well, isn't it? It's kind of a little bit floating. Never mind. Part of it is you also you need to, it can support running Android. Now you might say, well, why is Windows running Android when Android is obviously Google. And I think it's their kind of way of going, well, Mac's running, you know, the iOS, so let's run Android so it gives you that support. Of course, we all know from a testing perspective, you know, Android Studio would be more than happy to create a VM, you know, a Hyper-V or, you know, Oracle or whatever it was that they used for their visualization technology to be able to run quite natively, you know, testing of Android apps. Whereas, of course, you were limited really to, if you wanted to run a Mac emulator, you would or Mac OS emulator, you really struggled from a Windows perspective. And don't get me wrong, there was solutions and workarounds for that. And you know, I remember having a version of Mountain Lion running in a VM, and it was working fine. It did crash a bit. And then there was this generation, there was a section where, you know, when Mac was using Intel chips, that if you bought yourself a Dell, it would, you know, that you could do a Hackintosh and you could actually get the natively running on the Dell machine a Mac OS. Don't know why you want to do that. So the fact that, you know, we've always kind of struggled to have the ability to run, you know, iOS on a Windows platform. You know, I can see why they brought the Android in there, and they've also, by the definition of Android, they've also supported the ability to do Linux installs. So I've got kind of Kali running on my machine, as well as native, which just runs at boot level, which obviously takes more memory. And what's quite interesting about it, if I just quickly jump onto my my Surface Book for a second, is that actually you can browse the Android platform directly from your from your Explorer, which, you know, it seems like a bit of a strange thing to do, but it kind of shows you that, you know, they're trying to build that kind of ability that you can literally just, you know, drag a file across from your, you know, NTFS file system directly into you know, your Android device without having to kind of switch between VMs, which, you know, seems like a good feature, but I'm not sure how many people are going to use it. You know, I love the fact that I've got Kali to do my security engineering kind of activities natively built into my, you know, my OS now, and I can get it literally from the Windows Store. But, you know, and you can still do that on Windows 10. You just need to unfortunately load the visualization capabilities and enable them using Hyper-V to be able to then support, you know, running Kali, but it's not as native at the Windows OS level. I think, you know, this is a little bit more optimized. It's not, I can see from the performance monitoring, it's not really taking too much of my CPU or memory up. So, you know, I'm absolutely fine for it running natively in the background. But like now, you know, I'm still running 50% CPU, 50% memory, you know, and in theory, you know, I'm running at, you know, between 60 and frames per second, you know, in 4K. It's pretty much a smooth experience whilst being able to do other things with the machine, you know, check emails, and do my Slack channel, and you know, do all the kind of the apps that I would need as just a standard Windows build, right? So, but you do find some of these apps are quite nasty. Like my Slack channel has, let me just have a look, I've only got 5 channels on it at the moment, because I did have the MIT channel, which had 2,500 people. But it used to use a lot of memory. Now at the moment it's only 200 meg, but it used to go up to about 1 gig. Whereas at the moment, you know, New World's taking 8 gig. The live streaming app on the right hand side is taking 1 gig. So you know, it's not really, you know, it's, with the OS itself, at the core, you know, having 16 gig is pretty much being used constantly, right? But, you know, most machines would have 16 gig by default. You know, I genuinely wouldn't recommend anybody getting a machine with 16 gig, or at least if they do get 16 gig, they quickly upgrade it to 32 gig. Obviously in dual channel mode, because you need to have access to, you know, that full speed. You don't want just 1 or 2 DIMM in the wrong socket. So, you also need to make sure you match the memory. I know it sounds like a stupid thing. You know, in the old days it was, well, you know, I've got this 6615 config. I can mix and match it with other memory that runs at the same speed. Those days, you know, don't really happen anymore. You really need to align it, and then obviously your XMS kind of, you know, memory optimization by default into the BIOS is really important, because that's then kind of saying this is the best operating kind of speeds and, you know, configuration for the memory, instead of you having to work it out and type it into your BIOS, which no one's going to do. And I must admit, when I kind of refreshed all of my machines to make sure they were all TPM 2.0, you know, I found even this machine, which you know, I was running, I hadn't configured the actual memory speed to the correct amount. What I'd taken the default, you know, it picked up the chip, the Intel processor, which is, I think, is the 10th or the 11th generation one. Picked that speed up, and the memory bus it was running the CPU at, and I kind of was like, well, that's fine. Whereas obviously my CPU in this machine is running 6 cores, 12 logical processors at 3.7 gig, and my memory's running at 3600 megahertz. You know, there's always matching. It's like the old kind of 486, you know, configurations of it was just a multiplier, and then, you know, you have 100 megahertz or whatever it is, and it would be a 25 megahertz bus or 66 megahertz at 33 bus. You know, part of it is you want to match the CPU and the memory at the maximum speeds you can do, but also the maximum speeds that work without kind of having to kind of, in essence, overclock any of the items and put them under any real stress. You know, don't get me wrong, it makes sense to overclock, but you know, you get a lot of heat coming out of the standard builds, even if they're not really doing much, which is quite depressing. You know, of course, you can configure that using the power settings, which are a lot better than they used to be, to say, oh, well, run my processor at a much lower speed. You know, and this is kind of what you get from the Surface Book, which, you know, you kind of see that it kind of goes between jumping the processor between whatever speed based on the amount of use. So at the moment, the speed's running at 1.6. You know, as soon as I do something, it'll go straight up to running at the full 2.5 or whatever it is, 2.88 gigahertz, and it kind of, you know, that's great. It works absolutely fine, and it uses less, you know, it kicks out less heat. But I think it's more optimized if you're using a laptop than it probably is using a desktop machine, where it's literally just running at the full speed of what it can do and kicking out whatever fan you get. It probably doesn't help, you know, like I said, with the NVIDIA card is at 90%. It's, you know, it's using 7 gig of its own memory. It's you know, its temperature is 71°C, which is hot. And the problem is the room will then become 71 degrees after a certain period of time, because that heat has nowhere to go unless you've got your windows open, or you've got a very large room, which takes it time to actually heat up the entire room. Now, I unfortunately don't have that benefit in here, in the sense of the room's fairly small, so it literally doesn't take long whatsoever for it to heat up to a point where, you know, it's pretty bad. So I then have an aircon unit, which is great, probably not great for the environment, but it's great to keep things cool. But of course, there's a huge amount of noise that's associated with the aircon. So then I've got a bit of a challenge, because what I then do is I use my GPU, which I'm already using at the moment, as you know, and I use that using the NVIDIA broadcast tool to actually allow me to use noise cancelling using machine learning. Now, that's brilliant, and it's incredibly reliable. Well, it works for about 5 hours of the day, and then it kind of stops halfway through talking on a meeting. But, you know, part of it is it's like night and day again. You know, it's crystal clear, no one can hear my fans going, no one can hear the aircon whirling at a really noisy level. And so if I turn my aircon on now, you would hear it, and the reason why you hear it is because I'm using the camera microphone at the moment and not the standalone microphone. and I'm not using the GPU app because of some kind of weird compatibility with the streaming app that doesn't like NVIDIA Broadcast. I have no idea why. I'm not going to bother trying to fix it. But typically I will, for all the rest of the day, when I'm on Teams or anything else, I'm using the NVIDIA Broadcast as kind of my go-to. Now, that in its own right has a few challenges. The first is it needs an RTX card, so you need to have an NVIDIA card, and you need to have an NVIDIA card which is at least, I think, a 2060 or a 2070. And so that straight away, the barrier of entry is quite difficult, especially if you're not planning to use the machine for gaming. You're just purely using it for remote desktop or using it for your remote working. So I think part of it is, yes, you want to be able to utilize these kind of technologies. There is other ways to do it. So these Creative Labs Bluetooth USB-C things actually come with a tool that does software noise cancelling, and there's actually a button on the speakers which can turn conversation mode on, and when conversation mode is on, it uses the digital signal processor built into the actual device to noise cancel any background noise like air conditioning or your fans whirling. So you can kind of pass it off to other kind of hardware devices which have digital signal processors in them, or you probably find somewhere there's some software tool that uses just your CPU to do it. But of course the NVIDIA one is fairly battle hardened in the sense of it's designed for streamers to be able to just make the streaming sound be completely quiet around them. So you don't need the NVIDIA Broadcast, or there is other options, but it is important if you want to get rid of background, and also if you've got things like dogs barking, the noise, people knocking at the door, all that kind of background ambient noise. If you want to get rid of that, then you're going to definitely need to think about some kind of noise cancelling solution. Yes, there's software noise cancelling in things like Teams. Is it that good? Yeah, it's okay, but it isn't the same as dedicated hardware level ones. So again, you really need to think about, if that's a requirement, and what that again is going to cost you, because at the moment with the GPU shortage due to kind of PS5 demand and Xbox Series X, you're genuinely going to pay $600 to $700 for your GPU at an absolute minimum. So that eats into your $10,000 just on one device. If you've got, like I have, 6 devices, 4 of them have got RTX devices in, so they can do it. That's straight away eaten $4,000-$5,000 of your allocation just on GPU power, right? But it's not just GPU. I said, of course, it's CPU. I think CPU is probably the least of your worries at the moment. I think as soon as you hit 6 cores, you should be good with everything that you need. Some of the laptops, like the new Studio, for instance, even though it's a $2,500 laptop, it still only runs 4 cores, which is bad when it's using the latest generation of Intel. But part of it is they've done that from a heat perspective. So my Alienware, has 6 cores, and it genuinely just keeps the entire room nice and warm. But what I do to combat that is I've got like these devices that I can plug into the side, which will suck the hot air out of the laptop, and again monitor the temperature to make sure it's not going over that kind of 70 degree, 70 C kind of temperature. Now, you might not want to do that, and again, you might not want a laptop that's running hot all the time. You want to be able to do your basic tasks or your testing tasks without having to kind of worry about overheating your entire room. But genuinely, if you get a decent laptop, and you're using the Thunderbolt port to power 5 screens, you will start kicking some heat out, whether or not you like it. There's always a certain amount of drain on the base machine. So you might be better off with a desktop, which is genuinely, after doing the session on AI for testing with Tariq and Iran, I literally went from using a standalone desktop, which was a standalone laptop, which was a desktop replacement, which could power all of the screens and do everything that I'm talking about now, but did kick off a lot of heat, and the longevity of that laptop's going to be massively reduced to a standalone desktop, which has its advantages of being slightly more upgradable, but also be able to really deal with throwing some serious load at it. And yeah, it is good. It's nice to have the kind of your 1,000 watts or 650 watts worth of power constantly in there, instead of like the Alienware has two separate power blocks, which yes, it's still getting the equivalent of a desktop. It's a desktop chip, but it's only a small form factor, so there's not much for the air to get away. And of course, the aero of your case design is going to make a massive impact on how quickly you can get rid of that air, and also then the noise level. So you might think, well, I'll just water cool everything. Well, something still has to cool the water cooler. It's not completely fanless. So there's a compromise with every decision that you kind of make, and you just need to work out which ones you're happy to live with and which ones are just too much to sacrifice, whether it be noise or heat. And so I guess that kind of covers kind of your memory, 32 gig, cores 6 gig, M2 drives Gen 4 for the at least 6 gigabits transfer to avoid needing to worry whatsoever about disk transfer. And then I suppose it goes into network. Network's probably the biggest one out that you need to worry about, and probably is the most complex one. Maybe one that I can give you some advice about, but probably I know Scott Moore and Todd were talking about the kind of NFV kind of conversation, which is kind of something I've been talking about and for a long time, especially in the performance engineering landscape, around the fact that people are running load performance just pretty much since the 90s have been running them in the same data center on the same network, and not using geo-realistic load. And I've always been an advocate for being able to do that, and with plans for, again, the World Digital Report at the end of the year to then do a whole stack of geo-realistic load generation with NFV and NV built into it. And of course, Todd DiCaprio came from Shunra, which supported things like hardware, network virtualization, and software and network function virtualization, in the same way that Keysight has similar kind of capabilities in their kind of hardware and not just software landscape. But being able to create a realistic network is it's so important to say, so that you can deal with that last mile, that, well, what does it really look like if I'm walking around with a 5G connection or a 4G or a 3G or a 2G connection, and I'm trying to access an app or download a large jar file or whatever it may be. Now, of course, network is so important also on your own network, because as you probably can see, my bandwidth is getting saturated by the streaming tool. So at the moment I've got 8 sending about 6 megasecond, which you might say, well, 6 megasecond is nothing, right? If I'd have streamed at 4K, then I'd have probably been looking at 30 to 40 mega per second of upload. Again, not a major problem. Most broadband providers will give you 50 meg up and maybe 100 meg down. But you've got to think, how many more people are using it? How many more devices are using it? How much is that, how many is that time slicing between as far as your Wi-Fi? What Wi-Fi are you running? What devices are you running on your Wi-Fi that aren't running at the AC, 5 gigahertz one, and therefore forcing 2.4 gigahertz for some of those devices? And I think that's where the challenge comes in. So yes, you may have 100 meg link, but once you've shared it between a household of 5-6 people, you're lucky to get 10 meg, and out of that 10 meg, you're only going to have, you're going to have poor experience on that 10 meg. And then you might say, well, it's fine, I'll just put quals on the, on the actual machine, on my router. I'll prioritize the traffic. Okay, well, what traffic do you prioritize? What protocols? What apps are you going to give priority to? There's a lot of of complexity just with the standard routing and routing of that traffic. Typically I would run a gigabit, managed switch that would manage most of that from an enterprise perspective, and I plug that into my router, and I'd let that do the hard work, whether it be a piece of Cisco kit or whatever. But obviously that's not kind of the standard, home office setup. Home office setup is something that's provided by your broadband provider, who typically will give you something that costs them as little as possible, is proprietary to them. Some of the other, especially when you start talking about things like fiber, some of the fiber people purposely put in some quite naughty throttling of certain content. So if you think of things like the old days of peer-to-peer, they'll purposely restrict that to kind of avoid you from seeding hundreds of gigs worth of data that other people are downloading from you, and then they end up caching it or whatever it is, from a CDN perspective. So part of it is your default, whoever your default provider is, you'll find that typically they are quite strict with kind of the policy, and they'll always try and make it look good. So you run speed test and you're getting 60, 100 megasecond. You try and download an app at that same 100% capacity, and that's never going to happen. It might maybe a tenth of that, or maybe half of that bandwidth. And then as soon as you've got 3 people watching Netflix at 4K, and they've actually got devices which can support 4K, then suddenly you're going to have a problem, because they're all pulling down 26 to 36 megasecond, which straight away means that either their stream has to kind of drop and be smart enough to drop and drop down to 1080p whilst you kind of and throttle while you pull out the extra bandwidth, or someone's going to have to live without the kind of the connectivity, or the kind of throughput which they're expecting. So the way I kind of look at it is, as you come in from the internet, so you've got your local switch, wherever that is, you might have fiber to your door, you might have copper to your door, it all depends on how far away you are from your data exchange. So in our case, in the UK, you can use things like Sam Knows to find out what network switches in your local exchange, what the throughput is, how many people are also in that village using that. So yes, they may have a gigabit connection, but if you've got 500 houses all on your estate all plumbed in with fiber, suddenly 3 or 4 users are just downloading or uploading video content, and that gigabit connection to the switch suddenly gets really saturated. So part of it is yes, you could say, oh well, what I'll do is I'll just throw on a dedicated line, right? I'll just request from the provider to give me a business line, and therefore say to me that actually you're only going to be, your concurrency is less, you're going to maybe get 5 or 10 business users, and they're only going to be using it from 9 to 5. So if you're using it from 5 to 8, then you're going to be laughing with the amount of bandwidth you've got. But yes, you could get a business line, but you can also optimize what you've got. You could get a secondary line. Of course, in the UK, everything's owned by British Telecom, but if you've got different providers, you can get different providers to provide you a separate line to things, one for business, one for kind of general consumption. Now, again, that might not be the optimum solution, definitely on the wallet, but that kind of method is also a good way to do. Now, a lot of people, especially in the US, have started saying, well, I'll just move to 5G, and I'll just get a 5G antenna, and I'll just throw the 5G connection up and use the insanely fast data connection while no one's got 5G devices to power my home broadband. And yes, that works. But of course, as more devices come on, more 5G devices from Mac. So this is got a 5G antenna in it. This has got a 5G antenna in the iPad Pro. I've got a 5G antenna on my iPhone I've also got a 5G antenna on my Android device. So, that's 6 devices all connecting to the local network. And if I were stuck in a 5G subscription or something, I could be downloading off the nearest antenna or whatever for and utilizing some of that burst bandwidth. And I know when the 4G days kind of came in, you'd literally go into the Apple store and they say, oh, well, just because the 4G is so saturated, why don't you just swap back to 3G and you'll have a really good experience because no one's using the 3G connection anymore. I don't think that's the case with 5G. Part of it is it supports the entire concept is it supports a lot more devices on that frequency. But part of it is with the dual antenna as well. You're going to get a better quality. So then you've got a question of, well, why don't I do a bit of a mixture, right? Why don't I just get a load balancing network switch and plug in a 5G dongle dedicated, plus mix it in, with my 2 or backup kind of network devices. Well, yeah, that would be the optimum solution. And then you've also got, as long as it's powered by a UPS or something, you could then, have a DR for when the power goes out. You can fall back to broadband and still power your router and your browser, and your laptop's devices still can continue, and you still can have your video conferences. But again, that's an additional expense. So, doing more with what you've got is probably the approach that most people will, probably go down. And when it kind of talk about doing more with less, you've got a couple of options, I guess, is, the first one would be, okay, I've got a limited bandwidth. How do I make sure that what's coming into the router, which is provided by my supplier, gets to my device that I'm doing. Now, all of these devices, what you've got here, are using power, Ethernet over power. So, part of it is I've got a gigabit Ethernet over power, because in essence, it's like having a 10 base T, a network cable directly from the switch to the back of your machine. Therefore, but it just goes over power. For us, we've got the Earth, which is not really that used, but everyone's going to have a positive and negative. So you just pass all over the day-to-day. You can have a gigabit. You can support a lot more throughput. So it's like a wired connection directly from the back of your router directly into your machine. So that's going to give you maximum speed. But then you've still got to provide your Wi-Fi users with Wi-Fi, right? So my laptop, I haven't plugged in a gigabit Ethernet, and so neither has the iPad. So they're running off, in essence, AB. So yes, you can run, a Wi-Fi extender out of the back of the gigabit connection, which is what I'm doing here, to give me, devices that are AB compatible are using the maximum bandwidth of 5 gigahertz. But then you've got to serve the rest of the house as far as, those users and their bandwidth. So, I guess the first option you could potentially do is you could say, well, you know what, I'll just, throw together either the native Wi-Fi, what's built into the router, which I highly avoid doing because A, it's never that good, and B, part of it is it's then just putting more stress on the CPU of the router to be able to switch it between kind of the wired network and also the AB or the whatever Wi-Fi connectivity it's got. So disable that, plug in a dedicated Wi-Fi unit. Of course, the obvious one for most households would be a mesh system. So that's a peer-to-peer kind of connectivity. Instead of a network router of boosting the signal to get it across the house, is that each one of the mesh devices talks directly to each other. So you could, in theory, have 3 in a row and get an obscene amount of range. But then you can also put 4 or 5 in the house, and then what you're going to get is you're going to get a combination of those devices that if one fails, then it will go to the next one to connect. And if you put them into a kind of a mesh, then you're going to get a lot more resilience around your Wi-Fi connectivity, right? And you might say, well, okay, well, that's great, that kind of covers me off for my standard phone devices, your TVs, and all the kind of maybe your security systems and stuff all want to do that. again, it's a bit of an issue. You've got a problem that you've got devices that are 5G and run, and of course your mesh will have the ability to run 2.4 on the same connected kind of naming, but is that optimum? Because again, you're going to start seeing that there's a hard limit on the actual mesh and how many devices it can do, and you might say, oh well, that's 100 or whatever, I'm never going to get that. But I think it isn't that true. There is a certain amount of time slicing between those devices. If you've got what I kind of again call kind of legacy devices, so I've got cameras in each room, well, those cameras are running a steady stream, which if let's take Ring for instance, which is uploading a meg and a bit of your from an IoT device, right? So yes, your Ring probably supports 5G or 2.5G, so not a problem. But if you've got 10 rooms, 10 cameras in each room, then you've suddenly got 10 meg worth of data coming through constantly, uploading to the cloud, backing up your data, your in-house security system, right? And then you can say, oh well, maybe I configured that so it's not recording when I'm in, but when the geofence leaves, it starts recording. Yeah, that's probably a good idea, but typically people forget, and then if someone did break into your house, you probably have not got your security cameras on. So things like Ring are constantly on, and then every single one of your smart assistants in every room. And let's just taking this example, I've got one of each of the Amazon and Google equivalents. So they're always on, and if it's Amazon, it's also partially, unless you opt out, is listening into your conversation. So okay, so suddenly there's some more data going straight off the cuff there for my smart assistants. They're probably pulling down information, whatever that information looks like. And again, it's draining more device things. And then you've got your actual devices. So in my case, because of the test lab setup that I've got here, all plugged into my MacBook Mini using the Eggplant console, I probably got 12, 15 phone devices, all using different radios and different frequencies that of different Wi-Fi grades that I should really not connect them into my mesh, because they're just going to slow things down. So I need to connect those into another network for my test lab, a network for my mesh internal home use, and then one for for my dedicated network connectivity for video. So suddenly we're talking about at least having 3 wireless networks plus a dedicated kind of LAN situation, and that is the only way you're going to potentially support the throughput that you need to cover your house, and also the garden and everywhere else, and all your security and all your IoT and all your smart home kind of devices. So suddenly there's a lot of challenges just from your network side before you even plug it into your laptop, and then you've got a certain amount of upstream and downstream limitations. You've got all your packet loss, your time to TTL optimization now. So once you're at the point where you've got the connection, then it's down to what type of device you've got. Now, to me, the standard devices, which in this case is Realtek, is fine, but there is again a massive difference when it comes to things like the killer network connectivity is so much better on my Alienware than it probably is for my gigabit network than it is using just the standard 1 or 2.5 gig Ethernet connection that comes on board. Again, there's a problem there in the sense of the fact that it's on board means you're going to get more access to it, or you should have more access to more data because it's on the motherboard, right? But there's also the fact that you can plug in PCI Express 8 or 4 channel kind of cards to give you more bandwidth. And of course, if you're going to get something like a killer network, you're going to spend a huge more for that dedicated connection. And you might say, oh well, I'll just plug in a USB-C to 2.5 gigahertz, 2.5 gigabits per second Wi-Fi. Again, that's not something that's going to be that's going to work that well, because again, it's coming down the bus, it's going to take longer. You really need it on, as close to the CPU and memory and storage as you possibly can to just avoid additional latency. So, the killer network obviously has a lot of tricks up its sleeve as well. So it's kind of looking at, your Wi-Fi connection and jumping between them based on, how saturated they are, whether that one's performing better. It will literally optimize your settings of your network. And how long it waits for a packet to respond. Again, those kind of tweaks are great, but they're again not the default Windows settings. So you've got to think about how you're not testing as a kind of a standard out of the box. You're kind of tweaking your network card settings, your network, and also your software from an OS perspective. So again, complexity sits around your kind of network as well. So that kind of covers off most of the things that I think we need to think about from a lab. We've talked about kind of audio, we've talked about microphones in a way that we've kind of said you can have multiple different microphones who've all got different levels of kind of capability and noise cancelling. A bubble mic, of course, is the way to go forward with hardware assisted GPU, AI, ML for getting rid of background noise. You might say, well, I'll just run the one that's in my array, or in the one in this case from the Logitech. That will be absolutely fine, and they typically are. They are good enough, but you will find that there's always somebody on a call who's got a microphone which sounds like they bought it for like 20 pence. They're the ones that have kind of, for some unknown reason, still got a wired earphone with microphone on, and you just think to yourself, what are they doing? And then, of course, you could go down the headset route, and headsets are fine, again, but unless you're using a wire, you've got to then deal with the wireless latency between a Bluetooth or a receiver that's a USB. They do work, they are good, and, the headsets do give you better accuracy, but, I still would say you're better off with a standalone mic, which is kind of omnidirectional, so you can put it into the field of area which you wanted to speak into. I make a lot of mistakes where I kind of start looking at my other screens and don't really talk into the microphone, and the noise cancelling just says, oh, well, you're just noise as well. So you've got to beware with things like that. I see a lot of people using, like I do with the AirPods Pros, or the new third, fourth generation they've got now, which again have active noise cancelling, which is really good. But I wouldn't recommend using. You can use these under the Bluetooth 4 profile for Windows, but you're better off using these if you're going down the Mac route. There isn't really an equivalent for Windows for those AirBud kind of landscapes. You're better off again sticking with Logitech or somebody who's proven in the area to do really well, or Razer or someone like that. Again, it's up to you on what your brand of preference is. So definitely kind of look at what your microphone is, or if you want to use a headset, and whether it's going to be wired or wireless. I generally think the wired ones are going to be better quality. The wireless ones with a dongle probably is a close second, and Bluetooth is okay, but the Bluetooth profiles just seem to be not as optimized as they possibly could be. So again, think about your earphones and the sound quality that's coming out of those. We've talked about monitors. 4K HDR is desirable. At least with your either your G-Sync or your FreeSync kind of protocols makes complete sense. At least 60 hertz, 120 hertz, or 144 hertz. If you can get up to those kind of speeds, great. So I'm running 144 hertz on this one that I've kind of using for Slack, and I can tell the difference. But again, you've been able to synchronize, and obviously things like HDMI 2.1 do variable refresh rate. So it's a bit like what they've done with the new 13 120 hertz phones, is that they've got this ability where if it wants to run the screen at 12 hertz, then it can for reading documents, but then it can spin up to 120 hertz. Like this is 120 hertz on the iPad, And when you're running a game, it's it's night and day. So yeah, 120 hertz if you can, but like I said, it's very limited at the moment. So at least 4K 60 hertz is the minimum. At least HDMI 2.0 with a display port, is essential. Make sure your display port versions are up. I had a problem with the screen that I've got on the left, which you can't really see, which had a display port 1.4 or 2.0 compatibility, and it caused mayhem when you're running on. Obviously, to have all 4 or 5 screens, you need to use all your ports. So making sure whatever the amount of ports you've got supports whatever you're expecting your desired output. I did try for a while to run like a 2K, 4K, 1080p kind of configuration, and genuinely moving your mouse between them is highly irritating, and also you can kind of tell when you drag an app across to another area, everything just goes out of sync and gets wrong sizing. So it's best kept to keep everything at 4K, so it's easy to drag between it. Positioning's aligned, so you've got the screens that just flow directly from one to another without having to worry too much about it crashing. Keep it at 4K, keep it at the same resolution, keep it at the same frequency if you can. If not, the frequency seems to be okay, going between 60, 144, 120, no problems. So that's the screen side of things. We talked a little bit about how important, your processing, your, the clock speeds, your memory access, dedicated, drives for different things, your peripherals, utilizing your USB-Cs, swapping your USB-Cs across multiple rigs if you've got more than one rig, the ability to connect devices in, your Hyper-Ving for things like Android. If you really do need a Mac of some description, even if it's a Mac Mini, to give you that kind of ability to jump onto iOS devices. You can pull your own iOS device and just streamcast it using Parrot or whatever you want to use to be able to then test it, a physical device on a Windows PC. Android native, but also you need Android. I'd recommend use a Samsung or something like that, because you can then use Samsung screen mirror, so you can then mirror that device onto a second screen without having to fiddle around with with casting again, and it seems a lot more reliable. VNC, obviously, it's kind of the underlying applied technology. VNC gives you the ability to jump across these machines. Of course, RDP does as well. So if you've got servers in Azure or AWS, you can jump onto those quite easily, or telnet onto them, or SSH onto them. It's very easy to do and easy to manage. I think your keyboard and your mouse is probably your most important thing. So don't scrimp on those, because ergonomically you've got to be set up. Whether that be your mouse rest, your keyboard rest, the mechanical or non-mechanical things. The Stream Deck is really useful for kind of muting, unmuting. When you've got that kind of challenge where people, you're on multiple streams on multiple calls. Adds a massive value, and also you can it can tell you things like your CPU and everything else. Good speakers, which are going to be able to deal with the clarity of the voice. Some of the speakers are very bassy. You've got to be able to customize it as best you possibly can. I wouldn't worry too much about having a digital optical out natively on all the devices. I think you can get away with that. Just still analog for that kind of stuff. It's more important to have, good high clarity where you can actually hear people, because they're going to have different microphones at different hertz. So if they've got like a 22 hertz, microphone, which is really cheap, you've got to be able to hear it. Whereas, other people might be, using ones that are actually, a lot higher and a lot higher frequency. So, fidelity. So you should really make sure you support that. At least 4 screens, at least 3 screens, I'd say. 4 actually becomes a bit too much on your processing power of your brain. 3 seems to be optimum. 2, yes, okay, you can live with 2, but you'll soon move into 3. Having at least your Office, Slack, and primary testing of whatever, plus test management tool to be able to switch between. They seem like an essential as well. So hopefully that's helped you get an idea of what you need as far as the specs concerned, what you need as far as kit, what options you've got, what you're going to think about when you're going to invest, to give you the kind of capability to actually test everything, but also kind of future-proof your rig to be able to support the next 5 years without having to, once you've customized all your apps, having to move to a new platform. I think 11 will probably be good for another 5 years or 4 years. So even if there's a 12, I generally think you can get away with it. And I guess the last parting kind of bit of advice would be to, is your chair. Your chair is really important. The hardest thing I think during lockdown was obviously being able to find a chair that actually gives you the support, and you can try it. And obviously you can't try it because you're buying it on Amazon. But an ergonomic chair, supplemented. So I've got like my Tempora kind of supporting memory foam cushions. Using your foot mat with memory foam, for your feet. Give yourself the support that you need to be able to support your posture, that you need good posture, so that you are actually you're not aching, you're not getting back problems from just using your screen, using your rig for such a large amount of time. I posted the other week that I'd managed to do 20 hours straight. Part of it is you're gonna ruin yourself if you don't have a setup that's going to support extended periods of time where you're actually utilizing your entire system. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed that. Make sure you register for the event. The link's below, and until next time on Testing World.